Oh, hello there. Welcome to the second part of my 2D Mario retrospective. First off, thank you very much for the warm reception of the last episode. Sure, I'll go with that. The production of that video was a bit nightmarish, but seeing it get met with such positivity made everything worth it in the end. Speaking of which, if you haven't seen that video already, I'd recommend watching that in full before continuing with this one. It's not essential or anything, like, you should be able to follow this just fine, but having the context of my thoughts on what got us here would be pretty helpful. I'll be making numerous references to prior games, which obviously served as the basis for the ones I'm going to be talking about today. I mean, you decide what to do, but if it were me, I would go back and watch the first one personally. You may also notice much of the B-roll which used to fill the screen no longer does, and that's because I decided to use proper integer scales to improve the video's clarity this time. YouTube's awful compression doesn't do it justice, but believe me, everything appears much sharper now. But anyway, I don't want to hold you up for too long. Where do we leave off? Ah, here we are. Mario 3 is one of my favorites in the whole series. But would you believe me if I told you that it doesn't top my personal ranking of 2D Mario? Yeah, as hard as it might be to accept after I praised SMB3 to high heavens for almost 20 minutes, and called it the game that brought the series into true greatness, if I were to be asked about what I think is the best 2D Mario, or at least which is my favorite, it's not the one I'd answer with. Longtime subscribers, or people who just decided to look down at the chapters, are probably aware of what I'm about to say, but in case you aren't, Super Mario World, that's the one. Super Mario World. Let's back up a bit. The transition from the 80s to the 90s was a monumental period of change for Nintendo. They essentially revived North America from the 1983 crash single-handedly, allowing them to assume a position of dominance, effectively a monopoly. Japan had been buying the Famicom like crazy since 1984 and beyond, so they were basically unstoppable there as well. Huge stuff happened as the decade came to a close, such as the launch of SMB3 and the unprecedented amount of hype its overseas release experienced, which cemented their absolute industry power. However, astute viewers may catch that I've conveniently ignored an important piece of this puzzle, and that's because NTSC doesn't tell the full story. In PAL territories like Europe, Australia, and Brazil, it was not the Big N that ruled the roost, but rather a certain other company. Come 1989, they showed Nintendo that some things in life simply can't be controlled. Alright, let's dial it back with the theatrics. Throughout the 1980s, Sega Enterprises dominated a majority of PAL regions with the 8-bit Master System, which was not nearly as successful abroad. Nintendo made poor choices in these regions, enabling their competitor to reign supreme. Sega was tired of being second place everywhere else, particularly the United States, and so under the tenure of their president Tom Kalinske, the American division employed a four-pronged business strategy and the infamous Nintendon't campaign. This decision wound up pushing them to first place in the entire Western world with the 16-bit Genesis, or Mega Drive if you're not from the US. Many people, including those who had the NES, jumped to this console thanks to its impressive capabilities and persuasive advertising. All of this going on naturally begged the question, would Nintendo manufacture a 16-bit machine of their own? Well, the answer was of course yes. They had actually been working on one, but with Sega proving to them they couldn't get complacent, even in the markets they dominated, I'd imagine they started to pick up the pace. They wanted to build excitement, and so conceived the next entry in their flagship IP, Super Mario Bros. 4. SMB4 reportedly entered production as far back as 1987, before Mario 3 had released in Japan, but it would truly start to take shape around 1989, when it was shown off to the press at the Shoshinkai, later Space World event as Super Mario World. You can see photos snapped there on the cutting room floor, and they're interesting because of how similar it was to SMB3. It makes sense, they were developed almost concurrently, but as SMW progressed, it would deviate a lot, so it's like peering into an alternate reality. Regardless, it launched in 1990 for the Super Famicom, and later in 1991 in the US with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES. You see, the names are meaningful, and absolutely genius. It's more powerful than the NES, and Super is defined as above or superior, so its name refers to the fact it's an upgrade over the NES. Seriously though, I'm happy to have the chance to discuss this again, as man do I have a lot to say. Also, you might notice something interesting about the footage on screen. I presume it's on screen, which I'm itching to explain. Okay, no dilly-dallying, as the funny red plumber man himself would say, Let's go. I'm not doing the impression. Following the marginally complex story of SMB3, this game instead keeps it simple and to the point. Unfortunately, it's reverted to the same old, but things are still a little different. One day, Mario, Luigi, and Peach are on a trip to Dinosaur Land, an archipelago filled with prehistoric creatures, as its incredibly on-the-nose name suggests. When the trio arrives in this surreal place, the siblings go off on their own for a bit, exploring and taking in the various sights and sounds around them. All seems to be well, yet as soon as they return to where the princess was before, she's gone. They're initially confused, but quickly realize what's going on. Can you figure it out? If you surmise that Weirdo Turtle was up to his old tricks, then you'd be right! Congratulations, you've won the prize! As a notification at the start reads, it looks like Bowser's at it again, with the Koopalings from Mario 3. He swooped in while the brothers weren't looking and took Peach away with him to his lair, which is, you know, a castle. Bowser's just obsessed with those, I guess. Mario and Luigi now need to traverse the entirety of Dinosaur Land to track down the place Bowser is hiding, and spoiler alert, when they find it, they sure do, and rescue the princess once again. Hey, the text box used the word again twice in this situation, not me. Admittedly, this is where the repetition was beginning to set in. Pretty much every installment, exceptions aside, revolves around a minor variation of the same premise. Mario and friends are minding their business or preparing for an event, and then as they're distracted or even out of nowhere, Bowser and his gang of Koopa lackeys swarm in and steal Peach. Making it so Mario then has to spend the entire adventure chasing him so he can rescue the princess from the Koopa King's clutches. And that's it. I like that we're in a new location, and the setup diverts from the norm a bit, with the vacation that's interrupted rather than whatever the hell they were doing in the Mushroom Kingdom that day. Not to mention, the series isn't focused on story, so I'm willing to turn a blind eye, but a little variation between these plots would have been appreciated is all. Imagine if SMW concentrated on the unique, fantastical, prehistoric elements of Dinosaur Land, instead of going for a Bowser takes Peach away storyline. Specifically, if it followed Mario saving the population from Bowser's evil deeds, namely a species of resident I'll discuss later. It's Yoshi. Hell, Bowser wouldn't have to be the villain. They could have pulled an SMB2 USA and introduced an antagonist. I don't know how that would have been if it were real, but it's an idea. As is, the plot's whatever. It's typical for the franchise. So it doesn't stick out to me besides Dinosaur Land as a setting. But hey, the GBA version adds an intro cutscene, like the remake of SMB3 on the platform. So I actually had visuals for the story. That's always swell. But again, most don't care about narrative in Mario, so let's talk about stuff that really matters, at least to me. While the SNES was undoubtedly a huge shift from a developer perspective, especially since Nintendo's employees had gotten used to the NES and now had to switch to a related but still very different architecture, Mario World manages to look quite nice for how early it came out in the system's lifespan. On a related note, as you can probably tell, the footage isn't how a bulk of videos would present it. It may seem more gorgeous than you're accustomed to, and that's for a reason. I mostly recorded using emulation, because I currently don't possess a way to get video from the actual consoles that's up to my standards, and for some I've got no other means of recording at all. I have an OSSC, so SNES SCART isn't a write-off, but mine's a 2-chip, and thus its RGB output is blurry and awful. I could purchase Voltar's Edge Enhancer mod, but to be upfront with you, that's not worth it for me. Emulation is convenient and provides good quality by default, so that's what I did, but hey, I'm getting sidetracked here. Now you might be wondering, how did I acquire the ROMs? I was going to utilize SNES 9X, my favorite Super Nintendo emulator, but I heard there was a way to get widescreen for SMW with BSNES HD. I've always wanted similar fan projects to Sonic 3 Air for Mario, so you bet your ass I wasn't going to pass this one up. Using a hack, you're able to achieve 16:9, and it's incredible. It is a bit janky though. For me, it rendered in the terrible stretched CRT proportions, which I had to fix by swapping between aspect ratios. However, doing this cultivates weirdness that reminds you Mario World was not originally designed for widescreen. The horizontal margins of most stages have no ground at all, essentially producing a hole, or perhaps more accurately, a boundary that marks the edge of the level. Also, the final boss arena has exposed sides, which are in fact bottomless pits. And strangely, this is the only place where that's a thing. That's distracting, but I'm willing to tolerate it for the correct proportions. I can admittedly get very pedantic and picky regarding my footage in these videos, and this is no different. Besides what I've mentioned, it's worth it for the increased FOV, and I'd call it the definitive Super Mario World experience. I guess until someone comes out with a full-on PC port, classic Sonic style. Anyway, back to your regularly scheduled graphics talk, I suppose. The SNES was capable of a wider palette, and perhaps most crucially, more simultaneous shades than its predecessor, so SMW took advantage of it to create the most colorful and vibrant game thus far, albeit settling on a simplistic art style. I like visuals with greater detail personally, and SMB3 had a surprising amount for being sprite-based. So World slightly stepping back in terms of the intricacy of its tiles and whatnot is unfortunate. That being said, it's not like this lacks life completely, and I'd say it makes up for it with its liveliness and chromatic depth. As I've repeated multiple times, Mario World has a larger gamut than the previous entries, so therefore its levels are starting to look plausible, though with that wacky and cartoony Mario style. One substantive revamp in particular is the backgrounds, which give each stage so much more zest. Be it a grassy field with mountains behind it, an intimidating fortress, a ghost house, you name it. They're not that elaborate, often being uncomplicated pixel art with minimalistic shading, but having them was an advancement nonetheless. Also, the parallax scrolling is a pleasant touch. Despite the simplistic technique where the backdrop scrolls slower than the foreground, the sprites, including Mario, newcomer Yoshi, who I'll get to, and the enemies have more character than ever. Even our hero's full eyes or the Koopas walking around on two legs helps with this. There's also the charging chucks, who are football players that sprint at you. They're some of the toughest and most memorable enemies, and are so out of place that I can't help but love them. These sprites more closely resemble the promotional artwork than prior outings too, which is nice. Also, I just remembered, this art, illustrated by Yoichi Kotabe, is rather appealing. It carries the same style from SMB3, and it's inseparable from this series. The way everyone's drawn is simple yet identifiable, with black outlines and busy scenes that depict all sorts of scenarios. The North American box art is a little too bare bones for my tastes, so as with the other 2D Marios, I honestly like the Japanese cover more. Anyhow, what truly sells these graphics as better to me is how those shades are actually used. Due to the SNES rendering a myriad of hues on screen, the days of bizarre color choices that don't look right are entirely in the past. A minute ago, I mentioned that Mario World's environments are comparatively plausible, even with their wacky unrealism. In saying this, I don't mean to imply these locations could exist IRL, because that would be silly. No, they appear consistent and grounded in a set of rules as a result of the colors being utilized properly. The backgrounds help with this perception of mine, as they give me the sense I'm in a continuous location rather than a disconnected set of levels and worlds that only exist for the sake of gameplay. Which reminds me, I love Dinosaur Land as a place, since I dig the concept and feel it has interesting sections. Admittedly, it does get more monotonous than SMB3 in this aspect. For one, there's an overabundance of grassy plains and underground stages, and while they have different palettes to set themselves apart, it's a little repetitive.
Kind of like this script.
The courses that do stand out aesthetically, however, really do. For instance, ghost houses are introduced, a staple level archetype that future installments would also use. Conjointly, many ideas are brought back and given fresh designs with the SNES's help, such as magma stages, which frequently incorporate prehistoric assets, and ice courses, a rare type featuring a glistening crystal background like the rest of the cavern areas, or a variation of the normal above ground one that's been blue shifted to emphasize the frigid temperatures. Mario even does this at the end of them. Just look at him. Look at him go! I never get tired of that. Some levels defy the standard tropes altogether, such as Vanilla Dome 4's subterranean mushroom platforms. The worlds themselves are memorable as well, in spite of their tendency to recycle themes. Vanilla Dome is this huge plateau implied to be a dormant volcano. The Twin Bridges area has precarious wooden, bridges joining the land's peaks. Chocolate Island is distinctly Cocoa as its name suggests. The Valley of Bowser is a massive cave shaped like his head that dramatically emerges from under the water, which is preceded by a sunken vessel the manual confirms is a Koopa airship from SMB3. And perhaps most notably, the Forest of Illusion is a dense, enchanted, mysterious wood. Also, need I mention Star World? Weirdly enough, there seems to be a dessert naming convention going on. You know, Donut Plains, Vanilla Dome, Chocolate Island, Cookie Mountain, even though these aren't remotely designed after their namesakes besides Chocolate Island being brown. Sure, Nintendo, whatever you say. It's neat stuff and makes for attractive places to gaze at. Oh, and I forgot, the animations are nice. They're more so subtly improved, specifically by inserting in-between frames. Certain characters, namely bosses and Mario when he runs vertically, have a cool form of sprite rotation. It's very early SNES. So yeah, the visuals are fantastic and haven't aged a day. There's also a version included in a reissue of Super Mario All-Stars with a proper Luigi sprite, but sadly no 16:9. Oh, and the GBA port, which is kind of washed out, so I obviously prefer the vibrant palette of the OG. That's not to say the GBA remake looks bad, far from it, just not ideal, and it was clearly compromised so it would work on the Wideboy model's non-backlit LCD. There is a ROM hack that apparently fixes the colors for you, so if you want higher saturation on GBA, go ahead. But I'm using footage from the unmodified release so I can properly represent that. Now, okay, I know what you're thinking. Then why are you playing in widescreen on SNES when it's usually 8:7? And to that I reply, shut up. On top of finding it absolutely gorgeous, I like SMW's soundtrack quite a bit. And while Mario 3 still slightly edges it out in that respect, it's kind of splitting hairs for me and World doesn't trail too far behind. I just find the music of its precursor, chiefly the striking energy of the NES version, to be catchier. I see how you could argue the sound font is kind of weak, and I'll admit it's not as impactful as SMB3. Mario World is the first to utilize MIDI, or more accurately sequencing for its score, which if you don't know is when the music is comprised of various short samples that are pieced together in real time by sending instructions about pitch, duration, duration, attack, release, those sorts of things. This is in contrast to the chiptune used by the NES, or FM synthesis on the Genesis, both of which generate sound directly with PSGs and only occasionally employ pre-recorded samples. While I will stick up for the sequencing method and say it gets an unwarranted negative reputation, music is particularly subjective, so I'm not surprised some folks don't care for it as much. You see, that's what I mean. Two people can have entirely opposite perspectives on the exact same song, yet both are equally valid due to taste. And what SMW brings to the table in that area is no exception. To play devil's advocate, the samples are a bit unpolished and simplistic. Like Koji Kondo hadn't quite wrapped his mind around how the process worked yet and was making do with his limited experience. Later outings that used this technique would improve on Mario World's musical foundation, which came naturally as Kondo honed his skills. That's not to discredit SMW's OST, and I'd say it's yet another top-tier Mario soundtrack that fits alongside the rest of the series' pedigree. I like the audio presentation and the sound font as a whole, as it has charm, but I can kinda take it or leave it. In this case, it's the compositions that do the heavy lifting, and to me, they're exactly why this OST stands out. Mario World has numerous tracks I love, and they frequently spring to mind whenever I picture the plumber's best material. I'd like to think there's a reason you'll often hear this music around the internet outside of 90s Nintendo fans being nostalgic, but anyway. The most impressive thing about this score is its utilization of a leitmotif, which is where all the pieces are essentially variations of a recurring core melody. As in, the composer writes a sequence of notes that acts as a theme for the medium, and then throughout, the songs rearrange and remix it in creative ways. Thus, each is a spin on the same idea. Did that make sense? I hope so. This might lead you to believe the music would become very dull, but I can't say this happens. It could have if not handled with the proper care and diligence, but SMW does it in such a clever way that it avoids falling into that trap. Frankly, I find it admirable how Kondo was able to create so many unique variations, especially since each song fits the environment it's in. My favorites include the Overworld, Athletic, Underwater, Ghost House, and Castle stage tunes, as well as the boss fight and Invincibility. The main level track needs no introduction. Athletic is one of the most fast-paced and exciting listens. Underwater is relaxing and causes swimming to be infinitely more enjoyable. The Ghost House is rich in atmosphere and wouldn't be out of place in a horror title. And the Fortress has a tense aura of danger to it, which is paid off by the boss battles. A fitting melody for an all-out brawl with a member of the Royal Koopa hierarchy. And Resnor. Also, this rendition of the Invincibility music is the finest so far, despite the fact the primary instrument vaguely resembles a bunch of car horns honking. Even the songs I didn't mention, such as the maps or the bonus theme tune, contribute to the game's identity immensely, and I couldn't imagine it without them either. So here, I'll quit yapping to let you appreciate this for a bit. What's also sick is how, depending on whether Mario is riding Yoshi, don't worry, I'll get to it later. Again, I'm getting there. The music has instruments layered on, namely percussion. That's a nice way of emphasizing he's seated on the back of his pal, and it assigned an identifiable signature to him that would see continued use in the future. I don't think Yoshi would be as recognizable as he is without drums coming in, so it's good he possesses this. With that in mind, if I could alter one element, it would be, say it with me now, the variety. Yeah, I'm certain you're noticing a pattern here. I swear, Koji Kondo has the impeccable ability to craft iconic VGM, but they only utilize his talent for a relatively puny selection because the same tracks tend to be reused over and over. I wouldn't say they get tiring, but as I've been discussing, a greater amount of music never hurts. Although, as you're exhaustively aware of by now, this issue is par for the course unfortunately, and is by no means exclusive to SMW. Virtually all Mario soundtracks, especially those of the 2D ones, suffer from this to an extent. Look, I understand, composing music is a difficult job, as is artistic expression in general, and not to mention the hardware these came out on was very constrained, so it's to be expected that there won't be 100 different songs. I just wish there were a few more, you know? Would even 5 extra per installment be unreasonable? I don't think so, but I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes here. Regardless of that, a more meritorious critique I have, by my standards, is the GBA version's changes. On the whole, its instruments are compressed and lack lower pitches, but to be fair, those modifications were necessary. Now, my gripe is that the new samples they went with make it weaker, and when comparing the two, the SNES original is a lot easier on my ears. I do like how some tracks turned out. But others, not so much. I'm not sure if that's controversial or not, but it's how I feel. Like the graphics, there is a hack which restores the horns and bongos from the SNES, so go for that if you desire. Nevertheless, I enjoy Mario World's OST. With its use of instruments like the steel pan drum, its clever leitmotifing, its fusion of genres such as classic ragtime and an almost ska-ish sound, in short, I can see why it's so widely known. However, if you want to talk about a surprisingly controversial topic, look no further than how this game handles. Now, you may ask, wait, the control in SMW is a subject people don't agree on? It might be unbelievable, but yes, there is indeed a sizable portion of folks out there who argue the physics are not very good. At the very least, I've perceived a paradigm shift towards SMB3. Or maybe it's always been that way and I'm just ignorant, who the hell knows. Explaining why or why not something handles well will always be a tough task, since it's so abstract. If you're talking to a bunch of people who have never played it before or haven't in a while, it can be hard to articulate because they don't have that context as a reference frame. Even if they do, this matter is highly subjective, and what's intuitive to one person can be bass-ackwards to another. Consequently, you may not find this very convincing, but I think Mario World's controls are smoother than those of Bros 3. Its movement is rather similar, being modeled after 3 as the 1989 beta screenshots demonstrate, although it's been tweaked considerably, and for the better in my opinion. My reasoning behind this boils down to some mechanics returning from Mario 3. Case in point, P-speed is here, albeit it's invisible now, as there's no meter on screen indicating whether you've dashed enough. Despite that, it checks the boxes. Running for a couple seconds sends you to top speed, and then Mario extends his arms to his sides and travels further than usual. He also accelerates at more or less the same rate, so in other words, it's very responsive and easy to manage. I won't deny his max velocity is a little slower than previous entries, but I still find Mario is sufficiently quick that it's never detrimental to the pacing. In any event, I'm glad this was kept, and as far as I'm concerned, it's a satisfying mechanic with loads of potential for mastery. What really makes SMW's handling superior for me is, without a doubt, the jumping. It's a bit less floaty than its predecessor, which I typically favor in a platformer. Taking forever to descend from a basic hop is actually one of my gaming pet peeves. Not only is it sluggish, because the time you have to wait for your character to fall builds up, but nailing precise leaps is also a hassle, as the floatiness can cause you to overshoot what you're expecting to land on. It's the exact reason I don't like Luigi in the GBA port, for as nifty as it is to have him with you in single player, and how much less lonely his presence is. Similarly to his appearance in SMB2 USA, he stays afloat for such a large interval that it renders him basically unusable in my experience. At least for horizontal levels, it's not that bad in vertical ones. Weirdly, coin blocks also spit out everything inside them, and Yoshi doesn't swallow enemies while you're on him, so that's cool. Whatever, I'm getting off track. I do not mean to imply Mario 3's controls suck. Quite the contrary. Its courses are properly designed around them, so the floatiness doesn't get in my way there. With that said, after I felt SMW's changes a long time ago, and following countless playthroughs of both, I prefer how World handles. The plumber doesn't stay suspended in the air and dips faster from the peak of his arc, as I've said, which for me makes precision landing a lot more consistent and reliable. With that being the case, I wouldn't say Mario drops like a bunch of bricks in the slightest, so it's balanced. You're welcome to disagree, and I've heard people claim that they don't care for how reportedly abrupt the gravity is, but again, when it comes to analyzing controls, that's just the nature of the beast. All I can do is tell you how I feel, and I believe SMW has the smoothest hopping and most natural ground motion in the 2D franchise. On the whole, Mario is more free-flowing than he's ever been before, or so I'd say. Additionally, World expands the series' moveset, specifically with a new type of jump.
Spin!
It wasn't the first to do this. As you may recall, Mario 2 USA had a supercharge, and SMB3 introduced P-Speed, but those were activated with protraction of standard abilities, namely crouching for the former and sprinting for the latter. Considering how the SNES controller possesses 2 extra face buttons, mapping an entirely fresh kind of leap intuitively was simple, since all you do is, well, I think the SNES pad was absolutely ingenious, as evidenced by the fact most released years afterwards, including modern examples, use the same 4-button template. And it's sweeter when you realize SMW had the right idea for platforming controls within the confines of this setup. It, like the others, has a run button, which I've gone on record saying is not a design choice I'm too keen on due to its potential to induce unnecessary stress on your hands, but here they made a suitable call on how to assign it. You hold Y to dash, and since hop is on B, you can comfortably rest your thumb over both buttons. The spin jump is executed by pressing A, and Mario jumps while spinning around. This might seem worthless, but it's shockingly powerful. Landing one on a foe's head explodes them into a puff of dust, like Yoshi's Stomp does, as you'll see. An advanced maneuver I enjoy is bouncing on spiky hazards without injury. Aw, hell yeah, that's satisfying, if handy merely a few times. It's also utilized in hilariously devious ways in the absurd Kaizo hacks. Oh, and it breaks these yellow blocks with eyes that normally flip around to become intangible when you strike them, occasionally revealing secrets, so that's cool. The GBA version also puts it on the R trigger, a good decision. Besides those, I've got nothing else. I welcome this move. What's also cool, and to the point useful, is the power-ups. However, I'd say there are a couple aspects that were downgraded from SMB3. In particular, the loadout and world map flourishes are now MIA, and the hit system has seen a puzzling regression. In the former's case, SMW only allows you to carry one item in a slot rather than having a stockpile letting you activate what you've acquired between stages. Alongside this, toad houses have been removed entirely, as have the enemies that patrol the map and give you a reward for defeating them. This doesn't bother me that much, since there's plenty of pickups and an easy to reach secret area that guarantees you the best stuff very early on. As such, I'm never under-equipped, and the reserve itself is nice. Its object is airdropped upon harm, or with the select button. At the same time, I kind of wish the inventory wasn't scrapped entirely, since it added an engaging degree of strategy to Bros 3. Maybe it would have been OP here, I'm not totally sure, but either way, I'm glad later installments included it, or combined both features. As for the latter, the HP was inexplicably degraded from the improvements of Mario 3, whereas getting smacked with a second order power-up, such as a Fire Flower, in that game only reverts you to Big Mario. World knocks you all the way to your starting form like Bros 1 did, or SMB3 on Famicom. This is the weirdest thing Mario World does, and I cannot comprehend the logic behind it. Why'd they roll this back when it was fixed in Mario 3? The GBA version recognized how arbitrary this change was and reversed it. Honestly, it makes taking damage on SNES, my preferred way of playing, more annoying. At the minimum, the reserve sort of counteracts this, since it gives you a chance to reclaim the power-up you're holding onto, but if you don't have one, you could be screwed. Irrespective of that, it's just a band-aid fix, and I believe the updated mechanics should have been kept. With that said, I see this as a step forward. There are less items, but the ones present are immensely beneficial, meaning they prioritized practicality over variety in the roster. After having 2 animal suits that were essentially identical before, and some that were situational, I'm fine with them wanting to trim the fat. As expected, the classic Super Mushroom, Fire Flower, and Starman come back, and function as they always have. Though they finally made it so pickups always grant their perks to you, even if you're Small Mario in its higher order. In other words, grabbing a Fire Flower when shrunk doesn't act like you only ate a mushroom, so being hit after spawning one isn't a death sentence. This was an obnoxious bug, or I guess limitation, so I'm happy they finally fixed it. These are terrific because you already know. Interestingly, killing an enemy with a fireball turns them into a coin, so, that's unique? Yeah, sure. Along with these staples, SMW brings in several handy new power-ups, or most are handy. There is a dud, the P-Balloon, which makes Mario, How can I say this without... Commit DeviantArt! It doesn't control very well, so it's just a liability. Especially in a case I'll get to later. Back to the good ones. With the Cape Feather, Mario World's equivalent to the Raccoon Leaf. I've heard this described as game-breaking, and I can't entirely object. If you use it in the right way, you're able to fly past any level you want. With that in mind, it rules. First off, I'm not too agitated by its strength. You have to go out of your way to skip stages, a tricky act to pull off as a beginner, and I feel it improves the Leaf in every way. In my experience, the Cape Spin's collision is a lot more generous than the previous melee attack, and if you're adept at mashing, you can deal blows very rapidly. In SMB3, the Tail Whip felt torpid and clunky, so I'm glad they made these alterations. Is whacking enemies a breeze? Yes, but I'll take it for the combat reliability. And the gliding move is painless on the hands to boot. Rather than tapping the button to descend, all you do now is hold it. That's not critical for me, since I don't mind mashing most of the time, but I cannot deny this is way better and more accessible. Anything minimizing unneeded strain on your muscles is welcome in my book, and my book is never wrong, and this definitely applies here. I also think the cape itself looks appealing, especially with how it's yellow, or golden, or whatever you interpret this shade to be. It complements Mario's pants, and the way they animate it flapping when you walk or float is a nice touch. As is the fact Mario's hat puffs up in the air during falls from the apex of his jump arc I forgot in the graphics segment, yay me! But those aren't the only power-ups. What I've discussed so far are the ones falling into the traditional mold of Mario items. It also introduces one of the most iconic characters, the lovable green dinosaur Yoshi. Well, technically that's not fully accurate. Yoshi is a species coming in multiple pigments, but I'll refer to him as one entity for expediency's sake. Interestingly, Shigeru Miyamoto had apparently wanted a companion Mario could ride in SMB3, and some sources claim as early as SMB1, as a sketch shows. However, the NES's restrictions made it so this could not be implemented. With the SNES hardware's increased capabilities, the plumber was finally given the comrade he was meant to have. He was peacefully living in Dinosaur Land until Bowser came and trapped him inside an egg. Mario frees him, and sharing a desire to see Bowser defeated, the two team up. Yoshi is probably SMW's breakout feature, and is possibly the aspect it's most known for. He can be described as a power-up, which is why I'm talking about him here. He broadens your moveset, enabling you to do things you couldn't otherwise, and is focused on being a helpful tool that turns certain parts easier if you hold on to him. Also, I honestly have no better place to sound off about him in detail, so yeah. While on Yoshi, you can eat mooks with a Y press, and as is the case with most of Mario's alternative outfits, I find that a hell of a lot more fun than trying to stomp on their heads. Doing this typically earns you a coin, whereas Koopas or their shells give you a sort of special ability. Blue lets you fly, yellow erupts a minor tremor that stuns foes via the impact from landing, and red allows you to spit a trio of fireballs. These are rather useful, namely the flight. And if you utilize it with the Cape Feather equipped, yep, Yoshi's tongue is probably the move he's famous for, besides the flutter that would be introduced in his own game. Speaking of which, it's admittedly weird and off-putting in retrospect how that's absent in his debut, because it's so unmistakably intertwined with him. I can't say he's significantly handicapped without it, but still, it gets stranger the longer I think about this. Regardless, Yoshi is also immune to spikes, which is handy in a few places, can take out adversaries by crushing them even if Mario can't. If you can find wings, you're transported to a bonus level in the sky where you can earn 1-ups, and the Yoshis that aren't green gain the ability from the shell that matches their color, no matter which one they ingest. Of course, keeping this powerhouse without threats would be extremely broken and nullify making him separate to begin with, so getting struck by hazards on the side kicks Mario off and causes the dino to flee. To continue using him, you chase the guy down and jump on him, or must find an egg to do so. Ghost houses and fortresses also forbid you from utilizing him altogether to prevent cheesing them with his abilities, so it checks out. I'd say these stipulations reasonably nerf Yoshi, because you have to be careful to hold on to him. Although if the need arises, you can dismount voluntarily by pressing A. It's not very noteworthy, but it does result in this funny moment where you willingly drop him in a pit to reach a secret exit. More on those later. All around, this green dinosaur is fun to use in my opinion, and it's great to have a companion alongside you for the adventure, since there's a lack of friendly NPCs outside of him, such as the usual toads and whatnot. And I guess Luigi also serves that purpose in Advance 2. Anywho, I can see how this little dinosaur would go on to become a recurring character. He's just nice company. Additionally, the difficulty balancing has seen improvements from SMB3, which already made several major leaps forward concerning this. For one, lives are a ton more plentiful. I always max out the counter whenever I play Bros 3, largely due to the presence of simple infinite 1-up tricks. I can also do that here, but the catch is, I don't utilize such stunts, demonstrating the grander commonality of extra guys on its own. You may find that too forgiving, but I honestly see it as an advancement. I don't care for such systems and prefer experimenting with movement free of impotence, which a limited number of tries presents a severe obstacle to. Truthfully, lives had lost all meaning, so if it were my decision, Mario World wouldn't have them at all. But if they were absolutely necessary, then I'm glad they're a dime a dozen. A lot of 1-up mushrooms are rewarded for exploring, an element also present previously, except SMW seems to do that the most. There's dedicated bonus rooms where you're given a green if you hit all 3 blocks in a randomly generated order correctly. It's a bit of a crapshoot on account of the RNG, but I'm usually able to acquire no less than 1. I approve of this because, as I said before, practically copy-pasted now since it's like the 3rd time I've gone over it in this retrospective. I think exploration in a side-scroller is optimally done by creating hidden areas containing goodies rather than a bunch of intertwining paths. And World grasps this the best out of any 2D Mario I've covered so far. In conjunction, there's more than one section where you can grab a hold of a Starman and plow through enemies to get a combo on them. Like the other installments, defeating enough in a row without touching the ground or while invincible will begin earning you lives. And again, there's instances in the level design specifically laid out for you to do this. It's quite gratifying for obvious reasons. These should leave you amply stocked, but there's also the Switch Palaces, each of which have an opportunity for you to earn at least 1 life. Just guess what these have in them. Yeah, Switch. See, I knew you'd get it. When pressed, the blocks sharing a hue with it solidify. Some give you power-ups. For example, the green ones guarantee a cape feather, make sections a cinch, and open up paths for 100% completion. I recommend going for all of them because of how helpful the colored blocks are, and that goes double with the palaces being an easy source of a couple guys. Not to mention, there's also the Dragon Coins, a precursor to Star Coins from New Super Mario Bros. Each level has 5 of these, and gathering all of them gives you another man. However, if those weren't sufficient, the minigame they included to let you win 1-ups is reliable and consistent to succeed at from what I can tell, unlike SMB3's slot machines. This one is accessed from the end of the level, except now you aren't given cards. You need to bust a ticker tape on the goalpost, which rewards you with a number of stars determined by the height you cross it at. Collecting 100 of these transports you to a small bonus room with the same striped wallpaper, inside of which is 9 slots with items on them. You jump into the 8 exterior blocks and attempt to match as many of the same icons as possible. The more you line up, the more mushrooms you get. While it's luck-based to an extent, the timing is forgiving, and I typically wind up securing a win. Whereas in SMB3, the opposite was true. From everything I've described here, I'm always left with a healthy supply of lives, to the point game overs become a non-threat. As I said, I like it that way, because it makes me willing to try riskier strats, and above all else, waste less time. The most transformative enhancement in this department is the save feature. I've mentioned these, but you've got to remember, they're only in All-Stars in advance. In SMW, it was present day 1, and that's great. The plumber not following suit after Zelda included battery backups on cartridge in 1987 always perplexed me, but better late than never, I suppose. It's obvious what the benefits are. You're no longer required to beat the entire game in one sitting if you don't want to, and are free to pick up where you stopped after turning off the console. If you ask me, that's fantastic, as the initial experience is a lot less daunting. It signals to me that Mario was, with absolute certainty, moving on from the arcade model as a whole, and embraced a home-friendly direction with all the perks that come with that. SMB3 already seemed to endeavor for something similar, but World goes a step further and I'm for it. That's not to say the saving is perfect. You're only allowed to record your progress after ghost houses, fortresses, and switch palaces, and quitting resets your lives. But honestly, those are my only complaints. And hey, Mario Advance 2 fixes this, probably making it the better version, even if I don't prefer it. It might be a compromise owing to the portability necessitating on-demand saving, but still, an improvement is an improvement, and I'd call this one. Be that as it may, the primary reason I like Super Mario World so much is, as with SMB3, the level design, which is the strongest so far for me. It's also weird. You could argue its stages are more of the same, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you there. It has a lot of identical strengths in this area, and from a surface view, I can see how someone wouldn't be blown away by it, since the previous one had wowed them not 1 year prior. Yet, there's a few changes that alter this level roster for the better. I'm unsure if others will agree, especially considering the occasional harsher scrutiny I've seen SMW get subjected to in recent years. Yes, people are critical of it in retrospect, saying it was overrated, substandard, mediocre, bland, or forgettable. Naturally, that group is free to hold these perspectives, but in my personal reckoning, World embodies the spirit of the franchise very well. Clean fun to occupy yourself with if you choose. It might do stuff in a slightly new way compared to its 8-bit brethren, but at its core, I see the essential elements of Mario. For one, while I have heard the pacing is not very good, I can't help but dissent heavily. I think it's perfectly satisfactory and aligns with what the series has done up to this point. Admittedly, SMW does seem to employ a more methodical, explorative approach from the earlier games, namely SMB1 and Lost Levels, which were just straightforward get-to-the-end obstacle course platformers. They were relatively light on content, and so are borderline arcade titles. Oh. Yeah. I get why one would enjoy that purity, but I've always found the later entries a lot more compelling to revisit, because they have extra meat on their bones that keeps me engaged and are less janky. I would have an issue if this change in direction reflected negatively and made things tedious, but again, I don't believe it did. Super Mario World, way I see it, isn't as slow or plotting as you may be tempted to anticipate. In fact, I think it's the best in this sense, because it, for the most part, puts it into your hands. If you're proficient and are so inclined, you can play quickly. It might require above average planning, but levels can be totally steamrolled in many instances. God, I've said that way too much. But seriously, I must emphasize that you can make SMW snappy if you have a solid understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of Mario's core moveset. That's exactly how I like it, which shouldn't come as a surprise. You've watched my crap before, right? Right? The content proportions also achieve a nearly ideal balance. SMB3 prided itself on having brief stages, and they could often be at most 60 to 120 seconds. Mario World extends its courses, so they take a couple additional minutes on average from an objective statistical view. But here's the kicker. It doesn't feel that way. I'd say there's a harmonious level count to length ratio, and it skews towards my preferred way of structuring a platformer. Shorter stages that are more numerous. SMW does tip further in the other direction than its predecessor, but not enough for me to say these levels are tiring or things in that vein. That's because, in my opinion, the ways they buff them up are actually good, and not stupid padding to artificially inflate their duration for the sake of doing so.
Not that you know anything about
shut up. Its courses are longer thanks to interesting gimmicks that make the most of the mechanics. Geez, say that fast 5 times. Rose 3 also did this, as I went into when talking about it, but its levels tended to end as they started to get exceptional. In contrast, SMW's ideas come off as better realized to me, and due to the increased breathing room provided by the stages, I find them more elaborate and, by extension, captivating. What doesn't hurt is that they also brought checkpoints back. A necessary inclusion with the beefier courses, and they're visible, so their placements are less arbitrary to me. Like its predecessor, however, what I appreciate most regarding these levels is the actual set pieces present inside, and the way they handle exploration. I'll be perfectly frank for a moment. It's hard for me to talk about quality platforming without repeating myself. And if you couldn't tell, I say the same shit every time. The English language has a limited number of ways to say you like something, and an infinite amount to express negative emotions. So writing positive reviews that avoid rehashing the same junk over and over is nigh impossible. I don't know, maybe I'm a cynical bastard, but that's how I've quietly felt for a while. I wanted to forewarn you because, in this respect, SMW is no different, and the reasons I enjoy it are the same as all 2D Marios. It's got solid courses, and the exploration adds a welcome amount of depth. Mario World's design is very similar to theirs, I mean, duh, but I consider it the most feature-complete and mechanically satisfying of the bunch. Unfortunately, it does come with the side effect of its own population of auto-scrollers, but there's not as many as SMB3 by my count, and the ones here are better than a majority from there for me. Call me biased, but you know what? You win. I am biased. While I wouldn't say SMW is as hard as Bros 3, World has its fair share of riveting challenges that I find fulfilling to partake in. The way it organizes platforms, enemies, and hazards hits the spot. It's essentially just right to be truthful. And I might go so far as to say its set of levels is the most consistently dynamic, well-crafted, and thought out, from the entries I've covered. The amount of duds seems lower than SMB3, which is impressive, as it had next to none to begin with. World isn't totally free from weaker courses, but its batting average is higher in my experience. Its difficulty curve is a bit more complex than the norm, but if you follow the intended path, or I suppose the main exits, it's about as smooth as Mario 3. Much like that game, it starts out easy, but then grows trickier the longer it goes on. By the time you reach the Valley of Bowser, guess what that is? You run through tough and enjoyable platforming. This contributes to a great deal of replay value, and as in the best of the previous titles, I come back to Mario World semi-frequently and improve my skills with it. Which plateaued from beating it 100 times, but you get my point. I can list off numerous examples I find stand out, but I'll spare you and only go over a few briefly so creating this retrospective doesn't take the entire rest of my 20s. It effectively has already. Early on, you've got Yoshi's Island 3 and 4. 3 revolves around these, revolving swing lifts, whereas 4 is about not falling into this water at the bottom of the stage. And they're both notable since you can dash past them unimpeded, the latter being particularly satisfying due to the Starman at the end. Vanilla Dome possesses fun and interesting design, like its aforementioned 4th level that plays around with bullet bills fired from off-screen in a pattern attempting to flank your movement. Vanilla Secret 3 also springs to mind from this area, as do the Twin Bridges. The former sees you jumping on these friendly dolphins who resemble Yoshi, and the latter has 3 stages with their own ideas. Butter Bridge 1 is a mildly slow auto-scroller, albeit with decent platforming on these weight-sensitive mushrooms, and Cheese Bridge makes you sit on a track for a little bit. But Butter Bridge 2 brings the heat, as it's absolutely swarming with relentless Caped Koopas. Nearly everything in the Valley of Bowser, including the hidden courses, is damn cool as well, namely Chocolate Secret slopes that enable you to annihilate a horde of Buzzy Beetles, and Valley of Bowser 3, which features these lumps of dirt you must ride on that fall after however many seconds is labeled on them. And all that aside, Forest of Illusion, bitches. It's centered on puzzles and requires you to find a secret exit to move forward. I've heard people say they don't like that, and yeah, it is kind of stupid, but personally I feel it's memorable. Also, I'm engaged when charging chucks are involved, because again, I think their attack patterns provide the most active challenge out of any enemy. Although they can act weird in the widescreen hack, especially when destroying blocks, so that's unfortunate. The mooks are also used in a similarly interesting fashion to SMB3. Alongside chucks, there's the Monty and Mega Moles, who are, moles, wigglers, caterpillars that get angry if you stomp on them, fireball-spitting volcano lotuses, chainsaws and fuzzies which inhabit elevated sections, Rip Van Fish, Torpedo Ted, and so on crowd bodies of water. Porky Puffers replace Big Bertha minus the reenactment of Jonah chapter 1 verse 17. Sumo Bros kick up huge bursts of flames. Eries haunt ghost houses with boos and their big variants. Swoopers are cave bats. Bonsai Bills, holy shit! Thwimps are small leaping thwomps. Mecha Koopas. Enough said. And these gray Bowser statues shoot fire or jump when golden. There's also prehistorically themed foes, such as the imposing Dino Rhinos, their fire-breathing cousins called Dino Torches, Rexes, who can survive getting stomped on, and Blargs, lava creatures with a lunge attack. This roster of newcomers is supplemented by returning minions, like SMB2's Ninjas and Pokies, SMB3's Munchers, Thwomps, and Drybones, and Bob-ombs from both of those. Several staples were also given fresh characteristics, like the Flipping Goombas, later renamed Galoombas, Piranha Plants that hop out of pipes, and Hammer Brothers, which are basically mallet-chucking Lakitus. And fairly irritating. Apart from those assholes, these guys are utilized in stimulating ways, and as they did in Mario 3, serve as set pieces themselves. Nevertheless, I think you've heard enough, so let's talk exploration value. As I said a minute ago, Mario World's exploratory elements are done in the precise way I most respect. You know, focusing less on a bunch of pathways that diverge and meet at random you navigate, and more on compensating you with power-ups, lives, or an aspect I'll discuss soon. Yada yada, I've covered this to an extent. That being said, what exactly do you need to do to find these? Pipes are a common source, but in a similar move to SMB3, certain areas are only accessible via the flight abilities from the Cape Feather or Yoshi, providing an incentive to use them for a reason other than making jumps easier for yourself. Like the platforming challenges, this encourages revisits, stymies confusion, gives observant players a thing to look out for. I am saying the same fucking trash over and over, aren't I? You get it. SMW is the gold standard for exploration in 2D Mario in my eyes, and I love being rewarded with items or secrets for putting in the effort to search. Later franchises such as Sonic the Hedgehog and Donkey Kong Country would expand on these ideas, creating an advanced version of them, and this is refining what came before in Mario 3, but nonetheless, it executes the concept marvelously. I could list examples, but that's unnecessary. The clips I'm showing should do an adequate job demonstrating. Just check this stuff out, man. It's rad as hell. And yet there's one loose end I haven't addressed. You may recall me saying the levels were not only good, but also weird. By saying this, I mean that while the course's structure is damn solid, they can also be bizarre and unfinished. It's not an extremely frequent occurrence, and the game is well constructed, but every now and then there will be a moment where a section of a level is arranged in an odd fashion that can occasionally be eyebrow-raising, I must admit. Perhaps a stage has an uncomfortable amount of empty space, or haphazard sections that serve little to no purpose, or what have you. It's surreal, and makes it seem like some spots were thrown together. Take Vanilla Secret 1 as a case study. It's a vertical level, but there's random areas full of nothingness and a strangely loose layout. I get a similar feeling from Vanilla Secret 2 actually, because it's a flat plane with a bunch of Paracoopas on it and not much else. It's unorthodox, to say the least. Especially this far in. SMB3 also sporadically featured this quirky design in its stages, where certain sections had less cohesion, but to be forthright, World has more instances of this sprinkled in. It doesn't bother me at all, but it does hint that development might have had corners cut at points. Lo and behold, Miyamoto himself has gone on record saying he considered Mario World rushed near the end and felt it was a bit incomplete. Viewing its TCRF article again, you can clearly tell, as there's a hefty amount of cut content, my favorite of which is this cage where Mario would be carried around by birds. Despite this, I'd still say Mario World is a refined product. It's a substantial and polished experience, except for minor bugs here and there, and doesn't appear rushed from a glance. It's when you look closer that the seams begin to surface, and you can tell there were struggles. But SMW is so highly enjoyable to play that I'm often distracted from its sketchier moments. I think that speaks to the quality of the design. Even though I can tell there were shortcuts in a few places, it's strong enough that it doesn't give this impression in its entirety. I've never been turned off by a rushed game, and this is no exception. It doesn't doom the title to be bad. The devs just have to work harder to make it good, and Mario World is a notable case of this. That's all I have about the level design, but since there's nowhere better to mention this, the boss fights are the same as previous entries, in that they're easy and unmemorable. Some ideas are cool, like having to pick out the real Koopaling from a couple fakers for Lenny and Wendy, or tossing blocks from the floor to Big Boo. And there's neat visual effects, such as the Koopa kids flying into the background upon defeat. But besides that, these are standard fare and not worth commenting on in such immense detail. I will say, I prefer the replacement for Boom Booms, Reznors over the former, because they require a bit more effort. The animations after clearing castles are funny and give Mario personality. And I fully approve of Bowser. I don't find him too tough. You just land 6 Mecha Koopa throws, but he has genuine attack patterns to avoid. And for one of the first times, the battle feels like, you know, a test of your movement skill. That thing a proper last boss should be. I also think the music here is fantastic. It's intense and fitting for such a hectic confrontation. I'm glad they finally managed to get the final showdown right to an extent, so it's a shame their remainder is relatively poor. But hey, combat's always been the weakest part of platformers if you ask me, so these lackluster skirmishes don't detract from my enjoyment to any significant degree. You may think that's all there is to cover, and in most cases, yes. However, I've been hinting at there being another major element, which takes the form of the inaugural side quest in series history, the secret exits. As that name implies, they're an optional 100% completion activity, and in many ways contribute to the weird progression structure. Like SMB3, there's a world map, and you access levels from their icon, be it a dot or a building. That needs no further elaboration, and is a grassroots mechanic carried over from Mario 3. But the reason it's peculiar is how you advance through it. SMW is quite a bit more open-ended than prior Marios. It has considerably less stages than Bros 3, featuring 72 as opposed to 90, and is set apart by the fact you only have to clear a surprisingly small fraction of them. You can essentially pick the path you want by using the exits, which are exactly what they sound like. Whereas each stage has a main goal reachable by simply traveling left to right, some have one defined via exploration or a task that requires going out of your way to accomplish. If there's a multiple, the dot flashes red. Honestly, if a 2D platformer is to have non-linearity, then this is how I do it. I often don't utilize this admittedly, because I tend to do most levels in titles I enjoy, but there are instances it comes in handy, namely in the Vanilla and Valley ghost houses. The former unlocks the top secret area, which contains 4 item blocks and a Yoshi egg, and the latter, while tricky to intuit, lets you skip to the fortress. That's what these do, open an alternate pathway on the map, a continuous place divided into sectors in Mario World. This permits you to choose stages when they're available, like I mentioned. As an example of how crazy it can get, you can enter the front door of Bowser's Castle in 45 to 47 exits by following the main path, or as few as 11 or 12 if you're crafty. In other words, this game allows for greater customization of your journey than prior entries, and if you know where to go, you can beat it fast. Now that I think about it, this isn't wholly new. The previous outings had warps to bypass worlds, but in this case it's far more integral to me because of the abundance of different routes. That said, you don't need to use this for speedrunning, and can instead go for every goalpost. SMW claims that it has 96 courses, but that's actually a mistake. Or false advertising, you pick. Again, it's got 72 unique stages in reality, of which 24 have multiple exits. These are what there are 96 of, to provide meat for completion, or people who achieve 100%. As a result, they form the basis for a side quest, or full completion playthrough if you will. A cornerstone of future installments, namely 3D ones. Part of me prefers the older approach. I play as many levels as possible in Mario, and that structure made this straightforward. However, I can't deny I like occupying myself with the exits. Oftentimes, finding them demands out-of-the-box thinking, which is awesome to do on your own. I don't know, it seems like I'm saying the same things repeatedly again, but for real, these are a neat way to incentivize you to comb the courses with diligence. Admittedly, some goals are a little too obscure for my tastes. In particular, Chocolate Island 3 comes to mind, where you have to know to fly right at the end. This one is actually required to progress, and that's extremely idiotic, honestly. Valley of Bowser 4 also makes you drag Yoshi past this ordeal of boulder-kicking charging chucks to grab a key, which is obnoxious without tediously stopping and going. Besides these edge cases, I can get behind the placements, and they're usually well thought out. I go for them because I enjoy Mario World and want to extract the most out of it, and after scoring 96 multiple times, the idea of a mere 45 or 46 exits is gradually starting to feel wrong to even consider. Not that I'll get all the goalposts on every run from here on out, but they sure do consummate my revisits. With that in mind, why bother? what's your reward? There's one last secret I've mentioned every now and then, Star World. This is a region roughly equivalent to SMB3's Warp Zone, because it too acts like a portal between domains. You access it by finding one of its gateways called a Star Road. There's 5 of these, each corresponding with one of the levels in Star World itself, and you obviously arrive at later gates by clearing its stages, although it is a little more complex than that. You can utilize them to teleport around the map, opening the course connected to it, so therefore this is a sort of border world or interdimensional bridge across the various places in Dinosaur Land. Hell, the last one leads to Bowser's front door, which is how you were able to reach it quickly in case you were wondering. The Star World levels themselves are easily the most bizarre in the game, might I add, and embody that thing where courses lack a bit of design deliberacy due to messy and strange progression. I mean, one is literally a single screen. Simultaneously, there's more to these than meets the eye. Each has 2 exits, one of which does jack shit, dumb, and a keyhole that unlocks the next stage. Missions 4 and 5 also need the Switch Palaces activated, so yeah. It appears normal, odd quirks aside, but hey, wait a minute, what's that gateway on the central hill? It sends you to a super challenging hidden area, simply referred to as the Special World. And yes, that does indeed make SMW the first to have a brutal bonus world. These are by far the 8 hardest levels, and require real skill with the mechanics to clear. Their names also reek of the 90s. Ugh. Nasty. I dig the idea, but I've got mixed feelings on the stages themselves. I enjoy half of them and appreciate their increased difficulty, but I'm not fond of the others for numerous reasons. Specifically, I don't care for Tubular, Way Cool, Mondo, and Outrageous. Tubular is notorious, but in my opinion, it isn't very tough. The balloon is just sluggish and cruddy to control. The level itself is rather short, but I think the power-up sucks, zapping away any fun I could have had here. Way Cool is an obnoxious gauntlet of fuzzies on these moving platforms, but what's annoying to me is getting the piece of shit to go on the right track. Truth be told, I've always flown over this one with the Cape Feather. The only course I do so for. Interpret that information in whichever way you desire. Mondo sees you avoiding Hammer Brothers in a body of water with an oscillating depth. I like this one the most out of, I don't know what else to call it, the Stinky Four, but still, I don't find it very fun. Finally, Outrageous is the one I hate. The stage is way too damn long, and has an absurd amount of bullet bills and hammer bammers that get in the way. This is my least favorite level, and I don't like it. Sure, these stages are meant to be challenging, but they're more so tedious in my eyes. It's a shame too, because again, I love the concept and like the rest of its courses. Awesome lets you barrel through enemies with invincibility. Groovy, the title screen level, has decent enemy encounters, and Funky has a creative mechanic where the timer starts off low, and you have to eat green fruits as Yoshi to replenish it. There's also a line of coins in the last one spelling out the words, "You are a super player!" And it's like, yes I am, bitch! I don't know. The initial stage, Gnarly, is kind of underwhelming, albeit okay. These courses prevent me from dismissing the special zone as a failure, but it's a part I don't look forward to whenever I go after the exits. But hey, clearing the whole thing changes the season to autumn, and it sprite swaps most enemies to weird, surreal creatures. Mario Koopas, which is pretty cool. And hey, at the end of the day, you can never go wrong with the credits theme. Mario always nails the staff roll, and this is no exception. Especially with how it slows down when the younglings hatch. And then goes into an upbeat section once they're born. It's nice to hear after such a lengthy adventure. What else is there to discuss? I like SMW a lot and consider it the culmination of all I've praised 2D Mario for. While yes, it has generally rougher edges than SMB3, I still think they managed to create something exceptional. I'm not sure how others see it, as it's slightly divisive nowadays, but this is my personal favorite Mario side-scroller. Yeah, spoilers, World gets my vote for MVP in the retrospective. Reason? It fleshes out every aspect I love about the series significantly. It has gorgeous visuals that take advantage of the SNES, which is only enhanced by the fact you can play in widescreen through emulation, a great soundtrack to listen to, amazing controls I feel are smoother than SMB3's already masterfully refined movement, the most clean difficulty balancing thus far, especially with the save feature and reliable 1-up minigames, the most consistently engaging level design, and to top it off, there's a nifty secret exit quest that establishes the concept of dedicated 100% completion for the plumber, setting it up to be expanded in future entries. The GBA port is also decent and improves stuff, though I prefer the original. I don't care that this was rushed near the end. It doesn't seem that way. I guess outside weird quirks that are just nits around a very solid core. Say what you will about SMW and its minor changes to the franchise's direction, but to me, it'll always be the closest we've come to the ideal, fully realized version of the 2D Mario formula. By this point, I would forgive you for believing I can end the video here, as I've basically staked my claim on 2D Mario. I think the games are great fun and some of the best platformers. You may be waiting for my thoughts on the series' latest outing, but hold on a minute. I want to be thorough, and wouldn't be doing that if I were to ignore the, over 30 more years worth of 2D Mario titles. Yeah, the classic home console quintology everyone knows about were not the only Mario installments released during this era. There were also portable entries on the most iconic handheld, the Game Boy. This gray brick, which only supported monochromatic 8-bit graphics with 4 shades, was exceedingly popular and lasted a long time. It was designed by Gunpei Yokoi and R&D1, hit store shelves in 1989, and only got discontinued in 2003, 2 years after both the GameCube and GBA had already come out. It wasn't uncommon for Nintendo hardware to be actively supported for longer than a decade in Japan, but in North America, not so much. And yet, here was the Game Boy doing it effortlessly. It was an astounding success, established the Big N as a dominant player in the portable market from the get-go, and essentially gave them a monopoly, occasional competitors notwithstanding. Being their first handheld that used interchangeable cartridges, the company wasn't restricted to only putting a single game on the machine, and so developed, published, or allowed the existence of numerous classics on it, including those from both new and long-running IPs alike. In the latter's case, many iconic franchises, such as Metroid and The Legend of Zelda, would make appearances on the Game Boy. In some cases, these works are considered among the top echelon in their series. Naturally, with Mario being so popular and well regarded, he was chosen to headline a system's launch for technically the first time in history with Super Mario Land. Sure, the Pipeman had pack-ins before, but the GB was the first he was present from day one. A bit odd with the order I talked about these, but what can you do? The Super Mario Land duo usually seems to be glossed over in favor of more known stuff, a rather unfortunate thing, since if you ask me, these are a few of the most charming and creative Mario products. I am out of words to use. Anyways, they go all in on endearing weirdness in their aesthetics, characters, gameplay, and so on. An aspect that makes them stand out. Admittedly, the story doesn't give that impression because it's all about Mario saving a princess again. Except now, it's Princess Daisy of Sarasa Land. The plumber travels there after Tatanga, an evil alien, emerges from a cloud of smoke and hypnotizes its inhabitants to help him marry Daisy. You see, the damsel in distress and location are new, so that means it's totally different, you guys. In all seriousness, this is yet another excuse plot that I feel leaves no impact. I do like how we're traveling through somewhere other than the Mushroom Kingdom for the billionth time, and how there's a fresh antagonist, but still. Oh well, I'm not upset about this, because as I've been drilling into your skull, the story isn't why I play Mario, and I'd hazard to guess it's ditto for everyone watching. That's especially the case on the Game Boy, a console so primitive it's incapable of actual color or a resolution above 160 by 144. That was probably done as a way to increase its energy efficiency, in contrast to the Sega Battery Guzzler, Game Gear, but it is a limitation nonetheless. Irrespective of that though, several titles managed to circumvent these strict constraints and look halfway decent, a feat I'd say Mario Land accomplishes. It does appear fairly rudimentary, as is to be expected, but I can't get upset about this because see the last 10 seconds, but also since I like the art style despite its simplicity. The sprites are tiny and have stiff animations, but I can still say I dig their designs, and the same goes for the environments. The land games are known for being weird in a good way, and this one has many strange enemies that break franchise conventions, such as these robots that chuck their heads at you, seahorses that jump out of the water and shoot fireballs, and yeah, them. Series staples can jointly possess new properties, such as how piranha plants resemble taco shells, bullet bill cannons rise from pipes, or the fact Koopas now explode shortly after stomping on them. As I said, there's also a distinct main villain, Tatanga the alien, helping it stick out in my mind a little more than average. On top of that, I like the locales we travel through, namely the Chai Kingdom's bamboo forests, as well as the waterfalls. Tying everything together, though, is how they didn't try to defy the inhibitions of the Game Boy, but rather worked with them. As mentioned, the characters are small, so screen crunch is usually a non-factor. These running moai in the Eastern Kingdom charge in too quickly to react to sometimes, but they're the anomaly. And since Super Mushrooms and 1-Ups would be identical in black and white, they made the extra lives hearts, alongside the backgrounds being distinguishable via clever contrast. Oh, and the best part? The ROM hack Super Mario Land DX, which I played for this video, colorizes that shit, and it's never looked better. I'm not a fan of the new sprites, but thankfully you can switch them off in the menu. And it even adds Luigi. So yeah, for such a simple title, the visuals are surprisingly nice if you ask me, and the same applies to the score. I think this game has a damn good collection of music to its name, and to be frank, I'd go so far as to say it's one of the premier OSTs in this series. Sure, while the Game Boy always sounded less sophisticated than the NES, Land 1 gives that notion the middle finger with excellent composition and clever use of the system's chiptune. Obviously, it's all instruments generated with square waves and what have you, so every song sounds similar, but in spite of that, composer Hirokazu Tanaka achieved an impressive amount of variety. Additionally, their quite appropriate for their stages. For instance, the Chai Kingdom features loads of gigantic bamboo trees, as I already mentioned, so its background music is a traditional Chinese melody. And in the Egypt-inspired subterranean areas, such as those of the Biorbuto Kingdom, there's a fitting track for Dark Ruins. My favorites are... well, man, it's hard to choose. I like pretty much all of them. The iconic main theme of Biorbuto, the laid-back Muda Kingdom, the upbeat marine pop Sky Pop, the aforementioned sprawling underground theme and the Chinese flair of Chai, the triumphant staff roll, you name it. It's all fantastic. Hilariously, the Starman theme is no longer the invincibility melody we're all familiar with, but is instead a rendition of Jacques Offenbach's famous composition Can Can. That's just... it's weird, alright? Not that I'm complaining though, it's a solid rendition of that classic piece. Unfortunately though, I'm not too fond of the physics, and come to think of it, the power-up system. In both areas, land is akin to SMB1, but jankier somehow. And I'm unsure if I'm wrong about this, but it feels like these deficiencies aren't a result of the Game Boy itself. I mean, they were able to get Mario to control just fine on the NES, even with a fancy advanced graphics chip at play in the case of SMB3, so I don't understand why he's clunkier on the simpler Game Boy. I find his acceleration extremely abrupt, and he goes from 0 to 100 the moment you press a direction on the D-pad. In addition to that, he's a little slippery in my experiences, and takes a bit too long to change directions. These things could also be problems in SMB1, but I swear they're much more prevalent here. Jumping is functional, but momentum when falling is noticeably inconsistent. Mario drops at a sensible speed after reaching the apex of a leap, but if you walk off a ledge, he plummets like a brick. The reason why this can be annoying should be fairly self-explanatory, but regardless, it can get in the way during precise segments, since you might be caught off guard by how suddenly and quickly Mario descends. These quirks prevent Mario from feeling all that good to handle, severely hampering a great deal of the inherent fun of moving around. That's also not mentioning the item system. For one, the Fire Flower has been replaced by the Super Ball. It performs an equivalent function, but only allows you to lob a single projectile at a time that bounces off walls until it vanishes naturally. I'm not a fan of how missing an enemy means you'll have to wait for the ball to despawn, which is kind of slow for my liking, but it does the job. Worse though, is how tantamount to SMB1, getting hit with the Super Ball reverts you to Small Mario. I've already gone on a tangent about why I don't like this, but yeah, I don't like this. Be that as it may, I do think the stages are decent for a handheld platformer. I'm firm in the belief that clumsy controls can be negligible or tolerable with the right level design, and Land is definitely one of those cases for me. I wouldn't say any of its courses are overly impressive, but it has enough good qualities to be solid fun. It is cut back compared to the console games and features modest layouts, but this is on Game Boy, so I can't say I'm disappointed by it. And I find myself enjoying the stages for what they are. It feels in line with the rest of the franchise in terms of progression, hazard placements, and gimmicks, enough to hold my attention for its entire runtime. It also tests your skills accordingly, gradually getting trickier the farther you go. If I had to give examples, the Biorbuto Kingdom features relatively few mooks and pits, but later on in the Chai Kingdom, you've got hopping zombies that get up after squashing them, not dissimilar to Dry Bones and based on a creature from Chinese folklore, an abundance of piranha plants and bullet bills, and frequent sections that see you weaving through fireballs that orbit in a circular path, functioning as a version of the iconic fire bars. Or SMB3's nuclear waffles, I suppose. In my opinion, Mario Land's difficulty curve is smooth and reasonable, and almost never has seemingly insurmountable spikes. It also adds variety with 2 shoot-'em-up galleries, a gameplay style Miyamoto apparently wanted in SMB1. I find these to be a fairly fun diversion, lacking challenge aside, because of their creativity. Certainly helping SML's case is that it's very concise. It only has 4 worlds, each with 3 courses, and it's possible to clear this title in under an hour. So while it's simpler than the home entries, it ends before it can become tiresome. What I do find tiresome is the bosses. Well, alright, I'm not sure that's the right term to describe them. Underwhelming is probably a better adjective, but the other word provides a smoother transition and... yeah, fuck it. I don't want to ramble on about these for too long, but yeah, I find them unsatisfying. And that's by Mario standards. The series with Boom Boom. Literally all you need to do is get past the boss and press a switch. Doesn't that sound exciting? It's like SMB1 all over again. But here I find the Patterns, predictable. The Sphinx and Moai come to mind, as all they do is throw a slow projectile that's trivial to avoid. Even the final boss with the Tanga suffers from this to a degree, although not to the same extent. He has an actual pattern, and you're required to defeat him, since you encounter him in a shooter level, but despite that, his blasts are easy to dodge, and he can be defeated in around 30 seconds if your aim is good. Truth be told, I do like the adversary's designs, and I prefer a short but uninteresting fight over one that's tedious, draining, and pace-breaking, but I wouldn't say they're compelling at all. That's why I'm typically apathetic towards boss battles as a whole in platformers. For me, they usually end up on either of those extremes. Nevertheless, that's a relatively minor issue versus the limited continues. My absolute favorite thing you can incorporate. I just love having my progress arbitrarily erased from dying one too many times, you know? Yeah, like SMB 1 and 2, getting a game over means restarting from square one, and there's no secret code, so it functions closer to the latter case. I don't like that for reasons I've already explained, and it's definitely one of the things that's aged the worst about Mario Land. That being said, I'm more willing to excuse it here than earlier installments. As I mentioned, Land is pretty short, clocking in at only 12 courses that can be cleared in a matter of roughly 40 minutes. Therefore, if you game over, it shouldn't take very long to get back to the spot you lost. You can also earn continues by scoring a bunch of points, reportedly 100,000 or so, which you couldn't do before, so that's nice. Furthermore, it's very much possible to amass a solid amount of lives, because they made the smart decision to carry over the 1-up minigames that have been a staple of the series since Mario 3. Side note, but that's interesting to me, because in numerous ways, including the physics and lack of a world map, Mario Land seems to take after SMB 1, as if the latter's engine was recycled and modified. But anyway, this version of the mechanic yet again revolves around the end of every non-boss stage. Each has 2 exits, one at the bottom of this building and another at its top. If you enter the higher door, you get to play a sub-game where Mario rapidly flashes between 4 paths, along with a ladder, that alternate between having 1, 2, or 3 men, or I don't know, super flower? Sure. As with most of these, it's a matter of timing. When you press the button, you'll win whatever Mario lines up with, ladder included. It can be touchy, and getting a super flower when you already have it can be obnoxious, but it's not that hard to win a few extra guys. So long as you can do that semi-consistently, you should be stocked for the journey ahead. Knowing my thoughts on life systems, I'm all for this, especially since there's occasionally hidden areas that can contain hearts on their own, adding exploration value next to everything else. Not terribly much, but still. While I must admit, I would have greatly preferred if there were passwords, Mario Land's brief length means this could have been a much larger problem. In summary, I feel that Super Mario Land is a decent handheld platformer, and a welcome part of the franchise, but it's aged quite a lot for sure. It has several good to great qualities, including its charming and creative visuals, fantastic music, and solid level design. Its short length makes it concise and oddly replayable too, as in, I can clear it in an afternoon if I'm looking for bite-sized fun to occupy myself with. With all that laid out though, there's also aspects I'm unenthused with. I'm not a fan of the continues, even if they don't affect all that much here, since they're an unnecessary stressor, and the controls and physics are rather awkward in my opinion. I'd probably say this is the most unwieldy outing from the 2D Mario lineage, for the titles released before 2000 anyhow. I don't know for sure if that's accurate, I haven't played some of the newer stuff in a while, but still. Due to these things, I tend not to return to Mario Land 1 very much. As I just said, I don't dislike it, but since the others give me the same appeal, except refined, what reasons do I have to come back to this as often? Not many, honestly. Land was probably more impressive when it first came out, because those days, a platformer on the go that was close to one from a console was a novel concept. That novelty has sort of worn off, at least for me. Doubly so, since I only played this 5 years ago. But do you want to know about the exact opposite of dated, at least for me? To be fully transparent, the first Super Mario Land is not the reason I chose to discuss these seemingly rudimentary Game Boy titles. Yeah, it's the iconic one, and crosses most people's heads when you talk about handheld Mario. For me though, there's another entry on this gray-colored machine that embodies the best of portable gaming. Super Mario Land was a resounding success, apparently even shipping enough units to surpass SMB 3 by a little bit, so it was bound to get a sequel. Development on Land 2 would begin in 1991, the year World released in North America. I'm not confidently sure why they decided to wait, but it was probably a combination of being busy with projects like Dr. Mario and Metroid 2, and executives thinking a follow-up wasn't urgent. Irrespective of the reason, we ultimately wound up getting a second one in 1992. The team behind it, featuring Game Boy designer Gunpei Yokoi as producer, reportedly wanted to take it in a wild new direction, but started to backpedal thinking their work barely resembled Mario. Land 2 would be refitted to have more in common with SMW and its ilk as a result, but would retain the weirdness. The story immediately comes to mind in this regard. No, seriously. In a series where the same damn plot is constantly reused, I feel Mario Land 2 shakes things up in a compelling way. It's not this masterclass in dramatic writing. At the end of the day, its narrative is still a means to an end, specifically providing context for what Mario happens to be doing this week. But even if that's true, I appreciate the willingness to go contrary to the norm, because it makes the game stick out. It's not the only reason, but it helps. At its core, Land 2 doesn't involve rescuing a princess from a nondescript reptile guy you don't see until the end of the adventure, and instead sees Mario battling to reclaim his own property. Shortly after restoring peace to Sarasa Land, he returns to his archipelago, Mario Land, to take a rest. Once there, he realizes an opportunistic squatter has conquered his castle in his absence. It's Wario, the Mushroom Man's twisted doppelganger. And yes, this is indeed the debut of this iconic character. He's the evil equivalent of his name is literally a portmanteau of the Japanese word for bad, Aku, and Mario. Hence, Bad Mario. Bravo, Vin. He was described by his creator Hiroji Kiyotake, I surely butchered that, as the Bluto to Mario's Popeye. Well, it wouldn't be the first. He also apparently reflected R&D1's disdain towards having to use the old chubster, who they didn't create, but I can't find interviews or concrete evidence that proves this. If you have any, I'd love to see it, but as far as I'm aware, it's just a rumor. It would be funny if it was confirmed, however. Wario has been a thorn in Mario's rear since they were young, and was always jealous of the latter's popularity. This is apparently not the first time he's tried to take over the palace, but he couldn't resist with the plumber distracted by Daisy. He sealed the fortress's doors shut by scattering the 6 golden coins across the major landmarks. They're with his generals, wild animals and other creatures whom he put under a spell so they do his bidding. Hopefully it was with the hypnosis from this goofy commercial. Or this. You want fun? Wario show you fun. Obviously, Mario is not particularly thrilled by the events that have transpired while he was gone, and looks to set things straight. He embarks on a quest across the island to recover the coins, so he can unlock his castle and evict Wario. It's a simple idea, but charming nonetheless. I find it cool how we get to see another side of Mario. He's frequently depicted as an unsophisticated, selfless hero concerned with solving others' problems, but in this game, he sticks up for something of his own and settles a personal grudge. Additionally, I just like Wario. His exaggerated greed and egotism give him this aura of silliness that's inherently entertaining to me, and it's fun to watch this absolute meathead enjoy being evil. Outside the franchise, he's also a ripe source of memes, which are chuckle-worthy on their own. I find this plotline's creativity refreshing, and it's a perfect encapsulation of the kind of stories I like for Mario. They don't have to be crazy in depth, it could revolve around saving Peach for all I care. All that's needed is decent ideas with the right presentation, possibly new characters, and you're good. A little truly can go a long way. I can cite similar things about the aesthetics. I get it, you're noticing a pattern in this retrospective. I talk about the story, graphics, and all that in sequence for each installment when they're realistically not as important for the Mario IP. It's getting kind of old, I know, but I still feel these aspects are worth discussing, as, spoiler alert, I think they're fantastic. Visually, Land 2 makes numerous steps up from its predecessor. In my opinion, it's simply no contest, and I don't necessarily need to sit here and tell you that. Peek at both side by side and you'll see my point. Admittedly, it does have a standard appearance, with staple enemies that act like themselves, but that's a minor quibble. For one, the sprites are considerably larger. Whereas Mario had a simplified version of his SMB1 self in the first game, here he closely resembles 3, but they added a few extra details to it, including the white part of his eyes. I suppose you could say he's a fusion between 3 and World, albeit monochromatic, and that's cool. As mentioned, series mainstays like Goombas, Koopas, and Piranha Plants also abandoned the auto overhauls from Land 1 in favor of their traditional appearances. Normally, I may find a change of this category a little underwhelming, but I can't deny that these sprites look better. Take, for example, Goombas. They were tiny blobs with eyes in SML1, but have a full-on face here, and you can actually tell what they're supposed to be at a glance. I miss the taco shell piranhas, but that's about it. Furthermore, while SML2 certainly has a familiar aesthetic, it continues the Land title's tendency to introduce a fair share of unique foes. One of the reasons they stand out to me so much, despite their legacy as side offerings on the Game Boy. That was definitely a sentence. Some of these are wild animals, like birds and bees, and others are much wackier, such as these swine that shoot cannonballs out of their mouths, flying miniature moons that drop projectiles which explode into stars, sharks with boxing gloves, living toy soldiers, and walking Jason Voorhees masks. 'Cause you know, why not? Yeah, this shit can get weird, and I love that. As you'll see later on, and in potential future videos, creative new mooks, or imaginative designs for existing ones, are an easy way to make a Mario installment stick out in my mind. I also find some of the bosses memorable, namely this giant octopus, the 3 piggies, and interestingly enough, Tatanga's return. His presence in an adventure that occurs so soon following his defeat implies he survived this atomic tear explosion, came to Mario Land, and was put under Wario's spell, all within the time it took the plumber to sail back from Sarasa. which was probably just a few days. Regardless, his return is a clever bit of continuity in the land duology. It's also fascinating how he's been demoted from a credible threat you had to traverse an entire empire to stop, to a mere guard who's no more prominent than Wario's other 5 generals. It's as if he was only the warm-up for the true villain. In any case, let's move on. The environments are a lot more detailed than those of Land 1, and feature intricate tiles and backgrounds. Like Mario's sprite, they take after SMB3, namely because of their pixel density, so they seem plausible as building blocks for the various locations. Animation is utilized too, making the places feel much livelier. In particular, the water from the inaugural level's backdrop and this whale come to mind, with their pure beauty and unusual appearance due to all the animated foreground objects respectively. That was also certainly a sentence. That reminds me, Mario Land, the island, not the game, has many spots with neat visuals, as well as a commendable amount of variety in its areas. You travel through a huge tree, a massive house, a haunted pumpkin graveyard, a gigantic robotic Mario, a seashore accessed through getting eaten by a large Koopa, and even outer space more than a decade ahead of Galaxy. These are all such inventive ideas, especially Mario Zone, Macro Zone, and Space Zone, the robot, house, and space. Oh, and yeah, the worlds are indeed referred to as zones. As if this were Sonic. That's kind of funny to me. I'm also going to say that word a lot, so be prepared. Anyhow, another thing that makes it distinct is the themes. For instance, Space Zone consists of the moon and a field of deadly stars. Tree Zone has stages at the roots, in the trunk, within the higher branches, inside a beehive, and among the clouds. And Turtle Zone contains an ocean, a submarine, and the stomach of a huge beluga. Macro Zone and Pumpkin Zone are more similar on an internal basis, but still have regions like a grass field where you fight ants, and a large living room with huge books in the former, and a haunted house for the latter. Also, need I mention Mario Zone, with the clockwork levels, the one made of N and B bricks, a toy Nintendo used to make in the 60s, and the stage set near the robot's crotch made of balls? Yes, that's real. They knew exactly what they were doing. On top of that, there's secret courses which also obey this trend, like these huge fungi or this beach. I find the graphical variety admirable on its own, but the fact this is Game Boy software of all things is doubly impressive. I mean, a title on an underpowered handheld capable of a measly 4 monochromatic shades manages to have more varied individual aesthetics than those on much stronger consoles? That sounds absurd, but it's how I feel. The best part? Like Land 1, there's a DX ROM hack, and once again, this game simply never looked better. I think it was good in grayscale, but introducing color makes everything pop to a degree not possible before. It gives 6 golden coins a refreshing new appearance, freeing it from the constraints of the Game Boy's heavily limited screen and emphasizing the art. Certain things were given their typical designs, such as the 1-up mushroom and Fire Mario, originally represented by hearts and a feather in his cap correspondingly. I'd say the unmodified version did a bang-up job at conveying pertinent information through proper contrast and visual changes like these, much the same as its predecessor, but now they're unnecessary, and so the compromises were removed. Truthfully, that's a neutral fact. I don't really care either way. I'm just happy this entry isn't stuck in black and white, and I get to see it in the liveliest form. As with SML1, I also love the OST, and Land 2 has awesome tracks that are right at home in this series. It's catchy, fits the atmosphere remarkably well, has solid variety and stylistic appeal, and uses a leitmotif, further sweetening the deal and making for enjoyable listening. The chiptune is cleaner to me this time, as if they were beginning to master the hardware of the Game Boy. Likewise, while the composition is arguably not as famous as Land 1, I find it more complex and engaging to the ears. It's not by much, the two are close, but I ever so slightly prefer the sequels. Unfortunately, it runs into the issue I've been mentioning of only having so many songs, but as is common, it doesn't get on my nerves at all. My favorites include the upbeat athletic music, the jaunty seashore, the treetops, the haunted house's interiors and exteriors, the machine, the boss fights, and the iconic star maze, among others. wish I could go on, but I have nothing else to add. This is a great soundtrack. For real, hats off to Kazumi Totaka. The guy is a spectacular composer, and for my money, SML2 is his magnum opus. With all of that being said, these things don't compare to the massive gameplay enhancements made over Land 1. Oh lord, it's actually unbelievable. I can say that about several qualities, namely the physics. Mario Land 2's movement is so much smoother than its forerunner. It legitimately feels like SMB 1 versus 3. It's that dramatic of a step forward. Interestingly, this is not entirely coincidental. The engine was reportedly derived from 3's. That makes sense, as Land 2's handling is about on par with the console installments. Mario's acceleration feels perfectly natural, and he both gains and loses speed intuitively. Turning around is instant while not being too sensitive. The air controller's responsive. He no longer plummets like a rock if you walk off a ledge, you name it. On the whole, I find the act of playing Land 2 more fun on a moment-to-moment basis because he doesn't feel like a sack of cement. In my opinion, it's evidence immutable restrictions were not the cause of the jank last time, and instead the developers' inexperience with their own platform likely contributed to the clunkiness. It's crazy what 3 years can do for a franchise, you know? The spin from World was even brought in. They mapped it to pressing A while crouching as a result of the Game Boy's button layout, so it's a bit weird and not as assistive for combat, but it works. I don't find myself using the move as much as I did in SMW, though there are goodies reachable with it here, so it adds a little extra depth. I also feel the item system and general difficulty balancing are improved, the obvious one being the hit points from the International SMB3. Taking damage with a flower or carrot does not revert you to Small Mario, which is ideal if you ask me. Seriously, I can't comprehend why they decided to downgrade this in Land 1 and World. Well, come to think of it, the screwy release chronology probably meant those two were nearly finished or already out when the change was made for SMB3 overseas. In World, I feel they had enough time to alter it, but simply chose not to, and that's dumb. Anywho, I'm getting off topic. How are the actual power-ups themselves? Yeah, they're pretty good. Land 2 doesn't have a whole lot, and they're a bit standard, but also handy regardless. The Super Mushroom, Fire Flower... Alright, I've regurgitated this shit too much. This is a Mario title. You know the SMB1 staples are here. Albeit, it is cool that killing 100 enemies drops a star. I'm surprised it took them since SMB2 USA to try a mechanic like this again. To boot, there's a type of block only fireballs can destroy, a thing they utilize for occasional exploration. More on that later. SML2's ace in the hole is the bunny ears, its take on the iconic flight. In terms of functionality, it's kind of a mix between the raccoon leaf and cape feather, in that you can hold A to hover, or mash it to essentially levitate. This is extremely helpful for obvious reasons, if a bit OP. Mario basically won't descend at all, so you can float over platforming sections. Nevertheless, the stages don't always let you flat out abuse the ability, and frequently have tight areas that counteract it. In this way, it comes off as more of a perk than a full-on game breaker to me. In addition, the live system has seen a step up, and there's a much greater volume of them. You already know my feelings towards these. They're stinky and smell bad. That's especially the case here. Getting a game over scatters your golden coins, meaning you'll have to refight all the bosses, and if there's something I'd correct about Land 2, well, there you go. That aside, you're able to get a ton due to the bonuses. As in Land 1, you enter the top of the exit, now by ringing a bell. There's a crane where you time an A press to lower a claw, and another in which you jump into a Looney Tunes style TNT detonator so the blast knocks off an item. Similarly to SML1, you align cables so a flame traverses the path to what you want, and it doesn't travel wires with mice. You see what I mean when I said this duo is weird? Here, I feel it's a lot more doable to rack up guys, with the hook anyway. The TNT one can feel a bit luck-based, but for the grabber, there's a neat trick. If you delay through a loop of the music to the middle of the second, like so, you'll get a green mushroom consistently. Usually it's a 3-up, occasionally it's just 1, but the point is, the pattern happens to line up perfectly for this. I was not the first to figure it out, but I did so on my own, which felt great. It reminds me of DKC 2. I know to pay attention so I can construct a better future for the playthrough. Certainly helping matters is that there's a lot more hidden lives, and if all else fails, you can play a minigame with coins to earn men. Bizarrely, collecting a multiple of 100 doesn't give you a 1-up, and they act as credits for a slot machine. You can amass 999, bizarre to see in a Retro 2D Mario title, and you can spend them all at once to earn jack shit for some extra realism. And best of all, these quantities persist on your save file. Oh fuck, spoilers about my next. So yeah, SML2 adds battery backups, a big improvement. Hell, I'd say the system is a leap up from World. Land 2 is, like its antecedent, fairly brief, only about 90 minutes for a typical playthrough and 2 hours for 100%. So no such feature wouldn't have been the end of the world, but I'm still glad it's here. It alleviates any worries about losing all progress if I stop playing, and is handled intelligently, automatically recording your data instead of forcing you to do it manually, or limiting it to specific points. Frankly, I wish this was the way everything did it, whether a platformer, shooter, RPG, sandbox, you name it. At least show text following each level or mission that offers the option. I know this sounds silly, as a majority of games these days autosave, but you'd be shocked how few have it. Call it laziness, but ever since being sent back several hours in Heart Gold years ago after a failed legendary capture attempt, I've been paranoid, so I'm glad Mario Land 2 makes this convenient. Alongside all I've laid out so far, I think the design is damn solid as well. Is it the most grandiose in history? Probably not, and in a larger context, you could argue this isn't particularly special in terms of stages, but that doesn't change the fact I appreciate them. No two courses are exactly alike, and they're constantly trying new things. Even the finest installments can feel a bit samey at times, which Land 2 does an exceptional job at avoiding. With that said, what do I like about the philosophies of this series? I've gone over this already, but screw it, I think it bears repeating. I've seen titles like Bros and Land 1 get a lot of retroactive acclaim these days for their purity, and many think their diminished number of gimmicks makes them inherently superior. But this is a view I fundamentally disagree with. Personally, I find 3, World, and Land 2 far more compelling, since they have the simpler stuff's highlights, just with a lot more meat on their bones and greater variety that doesn't go terribly far. IMO sticking to one thing done a particular way is a needless kneecap to innovation. People are entitled to their own opinions, and if you prefer franchises keeping things uncomplicated, there's nothing wrong with that. However, that tends to get old for me, which is precisely why I enjoy Land 2 so much. It's not only the graphics that set each individual level apart, but also their mechanics, and it's thought out on top of being creative. The shortness helps in this regard too, but never mind. In my eyes, this roster is one of the tightest and stands toe-to-toe with the other greatest entries. That's a bold statement for an ostensibly barren, uneventful handheld title, which I'm comparing to the renowned genre definers that have been talked about in this retrospective so far, but I'm serious. To me, 2 feels better designed around the controls than its predecessor. Is it incredibly ball-busting, or does it provide insane freedom for using Mario's moves? No, but that wasn't necessary. Every now and then, all you need for something worthwhile is the proper consideration, and Land 2 is definitely an example. It's not too difficult, but I've always had a good experience with it, and at the core of this enjoyment is the stages that transcend whether or not they're challenging. That isn't the sole thing I seek in a platformer. Sure, it makes them fun when executed right, but my desires are simple. Is it well made for what it's trying to do? If so, I don't care if it's on the easy side. I'm sure we agree that the worst thing entertainment media can do is waste time, a trap SML2 avoids. This game is packed to the brim with imaginative courses. For instance, Tree Zone has a vertical level in the canopy with piranha plants and various insects up there, as well as one taking place in a hive full of bees that chase you and queens that act like thwomps. Space Zone is accessed from the top of this strange stage utilizing bubbles emitted by hippo statues, then sends the plumber to the moon to battle cannonball shooting hogs, small sentient planets, and living rockets while hopping really long gaps with low gravity. And the Star Maze, which sees you weaving in and out of these angry big balls again. It's an auto-scroller, sure, but surprisingly fun. Mario Zone has conveyor belts, spinning gears, bouncy balls, pigs, and bullet bills plastered throughout in fun combinations. The claws you have to wait on slow the pace down, but these can be skipped, so it all works out. Those are only a few, there's numerous I can mention. The one inside a whale, with bone spikes, and this bizarre goopy substance suspending water in midair from Turtle Zone. The haunted houses with blinking blocks, fiery cauldrons, and sections of enemies on rooftops in Pumpkin Zone. This run through the interior of a gargantuan building that ends in a chimney in Macro Zone, and so on and so forth. That's also not mentioning Wario's Castle, which is surprisingly challenging. On my first run, it was jarring, but I've adapted to it and appreciate this level's nifty set pieces, such as the skulls, giant spiked balls, falling platforms, and piranha plant fire spitters. I don't care for this part where hitting these camouflage pressure plates triggers a nigh unavoidable fist. It's a bit lengthy for having no checkpoints. The visibility is sometimes not the best, and deaths can start to become frustrating, but that's it. What's more, the progression is unique for this franchise. Maybe it's not wholly original in this respect. It's similar to World's structure in essence, but its exact concept hasn't been done before or afterward. Land 2 takes SMW's foundation, specifically the way it lets you pick your path to an extent, and pushes things a bit further by allowing you to tackle the worlds in any order. No catch, they're all accessible from the moment you clear the tutorial stage, including the harder ones like Space Zone. I wouldn't call this a groundbreaking feature, you still need to beat all 6 of Wario's generals to reach the last level, but it's neat. I feel it has untapped potential, so I'd be fully on board with future installments taking notes. Moreover, there's also a few secret exits, providing a bit of exploration for those who wish to engage with it. They unlock extra acts, like this course with a bunch of Koopas on gigantic fungi in Tree Zone, or this beach area with blocks and coins initially spelling Wario Land 2 that you can jump into so it says Mario Land 2. Now that's a funny Easter egg. It's stupid how dying on these could mean you'll have to find the exit in the stage you accessed it from again, since for some baffling reason you can't travel the path it opened despite the fact it's visible on the map screen. and this isn't even a consistent thing. And I find a couple potentially annoying, but it's nice to have these as an incentive to search a bit. Although that's also accomplished with lives, currency, and other hidden items, usually in a small off-road section. As with the titles I've praised in this multi-hour abomination, there's not a million paths, and instead rewards for curiosity. I'm not re-explaining this shit, you get the picture. I don't have a transition in mind because I suck at writing them, but the bosses are much better than those of Land 1 also. Now they have real patterns you must avoid, so they're actually worthy of being called legitimate battles, even if pretty much none of them are anything special. With the exception of Tatanga and his busted collision, functionally making the Fire Flower a requirement to win his fight, these are quite easy, but I get the sense they tried here, an impression other bosses don't give me. Wario is probably my favorite, as he's challenging while staying reasonable. He has 3 phases and uses power-ups later on. To my knowledge, this is the first time a Mario adversary does that, a clever idea I'm surprised more games don't try. You're also granted items between the rounds, so that's nice. Dying to the doppelganger means having to run through the entire final level, however, which is infuriating. As I said earlier, it goes on forever, and features what I call the DVD screensaver mook. Determine why by inspection, but the actual duel caps things off decently. And the song that plays during it is cool. Also, man, this cutscene of Wario shrinking and running off is hella goofy. Guy looks like a gremlin when it happens. Fucking weirdo. I think I've said enough. Super Mario Land 2 is solid and surprisingly creative in my opinion, and it's on the Game Boy of all things. There's little I feel the need to critique about it, and anything I could mention is a momentary annoyance that's not game-wide. Yeah, it's not very difficult, so its appeal might be hit or miss, but I feel it's a title a majority can enjoy. It's chill and charming with a unique identity, and I like coming back whenever I feel the need. I think the plot is refreshing. The visuals are nice whether in black and white or color. The score is catchy and some of the best chiptune material I've heard. It's thoroughly refined from the controls to the difficulty balancing. The level design is strong and varied. There's a minor secret exit side quest, and I think it's extremely unfortunate this is not quite as talked about as the series' other classics. It doesn't help that those a-holes at Nintendo themselves completely skipped over it in the 35th anniversary direct a few years back. Among others. When people bring up Portable Mario, it's almost invariably in reference to Land 1, which stinks. I like that game, but the sequel supersedes it in virtually every respect, and is legitimately in line with the home console entries. In my eyes, at least. It's easily my favorite Game Boy release, and ranks high on my tier list, so to speak. 2D or otherwise. If you want to experience Super Mario Land, then I'd recommend the second. Play both, but this is the one I feel is truly essential. And that's where I feel it's suitable to wrap things up for today. Yeah, this part was a bit shorter than the last one, but I discussed some of the series' highest achievers today, the cream of the crop, the main event. Well, excluding SMB3, because, you know, I talked about that one last time. In any case, I'm kinda glad I decided to divide this retrospective into multiple episodes, because let me tell you, this whole thing has been a nightmare since day one. Production's been going on so long, my family adopted a little gray kitten before part 1 came out. Her name's Pebbles, by the way. She's my friend. Somehow, this was even more hellish to create than the last one. For starters, I had to re-record most of the footage I collected. Near the end of the first episode, I began to hate what I had due to the improper resolution, bilinear scale filtering, and, as far as I can tell, scrolling shimmer. Thankfully, my SMW widescreen B-roll was properly evenly scaled because of BSNES's nifty overscan feature, but everything else, from SMB1 to 6 golden coins, recaptured from scratch. But that's not all. There were far more shitty takes I had to replace, and numerous rewrites, to remove repeated words and phrases and stuff. They kept delaying the project too. I thought I had it bad last time with a little more than 330 audio inserts, but here, well over 420. 420. Worst of all though, it was sort of for nothing, because shit got so bad I ended up significantly revising the script and voicing the audio from scratch, which entailed a full re-edit, so there's technically 2 versions of this video. Yeah, this literally felt like snag after snag, like I was in purgatory or some shit. I don't want to be overly dramatic or bitchy or anything like that, because, you know, I choose to do this, but still, after a while, it just stopped being fun. Regardless, I'm glad part 2 is finally done, and all it cost was a bit of my sanity. So, hooray for me. I guess. But hey, silver lining, it took a little less time than part 1, since at least I had a mostly finished script. As for future episodes, well, that's where things get tricky. Next in line is the late 90s, early 2000s 2D Mario Drought and the new Super games, but I haven't even played a single one of those for this yet. All I've got is this old footage of NSMBU from 2022 I need to replace, and the others are gonna require a PC upgrade. The DS and 3DS emulators run like dog shit on my current rig, and so does Dolphin. I have no reliable way to record good-looking Wii video, and no other method at all for the handhelds, so yeah. I'm considering putting this 2D Mario thing on hold for a while, but I don't know what else to work on. I kinda just want to get this whole thing done for once, but unfortunately, that probably means another long hiatus. As always, I can't promise it'll happen for sure, but don't be surprised if it does. That's all I have to say. I won't keep you here any longer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, whenever that is.
You know what they say, all toast.